It is a shrub, not a tree. The mustard plant Sinapis arvensis grows to maybe 2 or 3 meters in ideal conditions, but it is bushy, sprawling, and notoriously aggressive. Every person listening to Jesus that day on the shore of the Sea of Galilee already knew this. They had seen it creep across the edges of fields, popping up where it was not wanted, choking out the crops they had carefully sown. They had watched it send roots deep into the soil, roots that would not be pulled out without tearing the whole earth around them. And yet Jesus says it becomes a tree. The Greek word is dendron, the same word used for an oak or a cedar in the Septuagint. He is not making a botanical error. He is doing something deliberate with the image, and the first audience would have caught it immediately because they knew their scriptures. In Ezekiel 17, the great cedar tree stands as a symbol of the kingdom of God, majestic, ordered, a home for every kind of bird. In Psalm 104, the trees of the Lord are planted and watered, and the birds make their nests in them. The cedar is the image of a stable, glorious, unshakable reign. But Jesus does not reach for the cedar. He reaches for the weed, and there is a deeper layer here that most readers miss entirely. The word dendron also appears in the Greek version of Daniel 4, where Nebuchadnezzar's great tree reaches to heaven, a tree of empire, of human pride, a tree that is cut down to the stump. So the word itself carries the weight of both glory and judgment. Jesus is not just saying the kingdom is like a shrub that becomes a tree. He is saying the kingdom is like a tree that looks like the empires of the world, but grows from something the world despises. The cedar is what human power builds. The mustard is what God plants. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, he says, which a man took and sowed in his field. That detail is itself charged with meaning. In first-century Jewish agricultural practice, mustard was not sown in a field. It was planted in gardens, and even there it was controversial. The Mishnah records a dispute that burns with the heat of real farming frustration. Some rabbis forbade planting mustard in a garden at all because it spread so quickly that it contaminated the soil for other plants. It was considered a nuisance, almost a curse on the land. A single mustard plant could take over an entire plot within a single season, its seeds scattering and sprouting faster than a farmer could pull them. The rabbis debated whether mustard counted as a legitimate crop or as a weed that had to be uprooted on the Sabbath. So when Jesus says a man sows it in his field, he is violating the most basic agricultural rules of his culture. He is planting something that will take over. That is the kingdom. It is not a gentle seed that becomes a respectable tree. It is an invasive species that crowds out everything else. The man does not plant it in a garden where it can be contained. He plants it in the open field, the agros, the same word Jesus used in the parable of the sower for the world itself. The field is the world, and the kingdom is being sown right into the middle of it, without boundaries, without fences, without permission. Now the birds, in the parable of the sower, just a few verses earlier, the birds are enemies. They snatch the seed that falls on the path, and Jesus explains plainly that these birds represent the evil one who steals the word from the heart. So when the same birds appear here nesting in the branches of the mustard plant, something is off. The listener has been trained to hear the word birds and think threat. But now they are nesting, which in the Old Testament is a picture of peace, the nations finding shelter under God's reign. So which is it? Are the birds the enemy from the sower parable, or are they the nations from Ezekiel's prophecy? The text does not resolve this cleanly, and it is not meant to. The tension is the point. And it is a tension that presses harder the longer you sit with it. Because in the sower parable, the birds do not just take the seed, they eat it. They consume it. They are predators. But in the mustard seed parable, the birds are not eating the seed. They are nesting in the branches. They have found a home. That is a different relationship entirely. And yet the same Greek word, pitana, is used in both parables, the same birds, the same creatures. Jesus does not give them a different name. He does not explain that these are good birds, not bad birds. He leaves them as birds. The kingdom of heaven is growing in a way that is both gathering and dangerous, both sheltering and invasive. The birds will come, but some of them are predators, and the tree does not discriminate. The branches that shelter also trap. The shade that cools also hides what you cannot see coming. That is not how we usually hear this parable. Most of the time it gets flattened into a motivational poster, small beginnings, big endings hang in there. But the mustard seed is not a story about gradual progress. It is a warning that what God plants will not stay where you put it. It will break through the boundaries you have built around your life, your church, your theology. The man in the parable does not contain the plant. He does not prune it or train it or shape it into something respectable. He just sows it, and it does what mustard does. It takes over. The person who hears this parable and thinks it is about patience is missing the violence in the metaphor. The mustard seed does not ask permission. It does not wait for the soil to be ready. It grows where it is planted, and then it grows beyond where it was planted, and eventually the whole field belongs to it. That might sound beautiful until you realize you are the field. You are the soil the seed invades. You are the garden that gets overtaken, and you have no say in where it spreads. The man sowed it, and then he walked away. He did not stay to supervise. He did not draw a circle around the seed and say it must not cross this line. The seed grows, and the growth is the point, not the gardener's control. And here is the hard question. What if you do not want the field to be taken over? What if you have carefully arranged your garden, your priorities, your relationships, your sense of control, and the kingdom shows up as a weed that threatens to ruin the symmetry? You had your life ordered. You had your faith in a manageable box. You had your church programs and your comfortable theology and your predictable Sunday mornings. And then something wild began to grow. A conviction you did not ask for. A love you could not contain. A mercy that forced you to forgive someone who did not deserve it. A justice that made you uncomfortable with your own comforts. That is the mustard seed. It does not ask if you are ready. It does not wait for you to clear a space. It grows whether you want it to or not. The parable does not apologize for that. Jesus does not say the kingdom will make your life more organized or more comfortable. He says it will grow, and it will grow in ways that disrupt every category you have for what is proper and safe and manageable. The Greek word for grow is not used here. Instead, he says the seed becomes a tree, using the verb genomai, which means to come into being, to be transformed into something new. The kingdom does not get bigger over time in the way a business expands. It becomes something entirely other than what it started as. A seed becomes a shrub becomes a tree. A kingdom that looks like a peasant from Galilee becomes a force that shakes the empires of the world. But the line between miracle and menace is thin in this parable, which brings us back to the birds. They are still nesting in those branches, and we have not settled what they mean. The parable does not settle it either. It ends with the image of the birds making their home, and the next parable begins immediately. The yeast that a woman hides in 3 measures of flour until all of it is leavened. And there the same tension appears. Yeast in the Old Testament is almost always a symbol of corruption and impurity, something that must be removed before Passover. But here it is hidden inside the meal, working silently and entirely until the whole batch is transformed. The kingdom is like yeast. The kingdom is like a weed. The kingdom is like a seed that becomes a tree that should not be a tree. Every image is slightly wrong, slightly off, slightly unnerving. The parables are not designed to make the kingdom easier to understand. They are designed to make it harder to misunderstand. The kingdom is not the nice thing you thought it was. It is the thing that, once planted, cannot be uprooted. It is the thing that, once hidden in the dough, cannot be separated out again. So the seed is planted in the field. The man is not a careful gardener. He is a sower of something wild. The birds are coming. Some of them are welcome, and some of them are not. The branches are growing. The plant is spreading, and you are standing there in the middle of the field, wondering if you are about to be overtaken or sheltered. And the parable does not tell you which, because the answer is both. The kingdom will shelter you, and the kingdom will uproot you. And the only question that matters is whether you will recognize it when it comes. Not a promise that you will recognize it when it comes. A promise that it will come whether you recognize it or not. The next parable begins immediately, and it deepens the unease. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast, Jesus says, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The word for hid is encrypto, to conceal, to bury, to place something inside something else with the intention that it remain unseen. The woman does not stir the yeast into the flour. She hides it. There is a deliberateness to the action that is almost subversive. She takes something small and invisible and she buries it in the middle of the dough, and then she waits. And while she waits, the yeast works. It does not announce itself. It does not push up through the surface like the mustard seed does. It spreads cell by cell, molecule by molecule, until every part of the dough has been touched by it. By the time you see the change has already happened. Now the word itself, zyme in Greek yeast, leaven. Every Jew in the 1st century knew exactly what yeast meant. In Exodus, the command is absolute for 7 days. No leaven shall be found in your houses. The Passover meal is unleavened bread, matzah, the bread of affliction, the bread that had no time to rise. Leaven was associated with corruption, with the old life in Egypt, with the impurity that had to be purged before God could dwell among his people. By the time of Jesus, the metaphor had hardened. The rabbis used leaven to represent the evil inclination, the yetzer hara, the sinful impulse that swells within a person like yeast swells in dough. Paul picks this up explicitly in 1 Corinthians: cleanse out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump. Leaven is sin. Leaven is what must be removed. And Jesus takes that word, that loaded, dangerous, theologically charged word, and he says the kingdom of heaven is exactly like that. The kingdom is the thing that must be purged. The kingdom is the thing that corrupts, except it does not corrupt. It transforms. That is the scandal of the parable, and it lands differently when you let the full weight of the Old Testament context press against it. The woman is not baking bread for a normal meal. 3 measures of flour is what Sarah used when she baked for the angels in Genesis 18. It is a massive amount, about 22 pounds of flour, enough to feed 100 people. This is not a domestic scene. This is an eschatological banquet. The woman is preparing the feast of the kingdom, and she hides the yeast inside it, which means the kingdom comes not by removing the corruption, but by transforming it from within. The old leaven is not scraped away. It is taken up, buried, and remade. The thing that stood for sin becomes the vehicle of salvation. That is not a gentle image. That is a violent theological reversal. The world says purity requires separation. The kingdom says purity requires penetration. The yeast does not stay in its own corner. It invades the flour until the flour is no longer flour but dough, and then bread, and then food for the feast. So the mustard seed and the yeast are telling the same story from 2 different angles. The mustard seed grows visibly, publicly, invasively, a weed that becomes a tree, a nuisance that becomes a shelter. The yeast grows invisibly, secretly, internally, a corruption that becomes the agent of transformation. The kingdom comes both ways. It takes over from the outside, and it takes over from the inside, and you have no defense against either. You cannot stop a seed from growing once it is in the soil. You cannot unleaven dough once the yeast is hidden in it. The only thing you can do is stand there and watch it happen, and the parables force you to reckon with whether you are glad about it or terrified. And that is the question that keeps pressing through both parables. Are you glad the kingdom is like this? Because most of the time, we want the kingdom to be like something else. We want it to be predictable. We want it to respect our boundaries. We want it to grow in ways that make sense to us, slow enough to manage, small enough to contain, respectable enough to invite our neighbors to. But the mustard seed does not ask what you want. The yeast does not check your preferences. They grow, they spread, they take over. And the person who hears these parables and feels only comfort has not heard them correctly. There is a warning in every image. The tree that shelters also dominates. The yeast that transforms also dissolves the original form of the dough. The kingdom will change you, and it will change you into something you did not choose to become. Back to the birds. They are still nesting in the branches of that mustard tree, and we can now see more clearly what is happening. In Ezekiel 31, the great cedar of Assyria is cut down because of its pride. The birds that nested in its branches scatter. The tree that seemed eternal is reduced to rubble. But the mustard tree, the weed that should not be a tree, stands. It is not cut down. The birds keep nesting. The kingdom of heaven will not be felled like the empires of the world, because it was never built on the same foundation. The cedar was proud. The mustard is humble. The cedar was planted by kings. The mustard was sown by a peasant. The cedar grew tall and straight and impressive. The mustard grows low and spreading and invasive. And that is the warning hidden inside the promise. The kingdom is permanent not because it is strong, but because it is insignificant. The world does not see it coming. The world does not take it seriously. The world does not bother to cut it down because it looks like a weed. And by the time the world realizes what is happening, the weed has taken over the whole field. You can feel the weight of that warning shift from the first century to the present. The contemporary church has spent a great deal of energy trying to become a cedar. Building programs, political influence, cultural relevance, numerical growth, all of it aimed at looking like a tree worth noticing. But the parable of the mustard seed suggests that the kingdom does not need to look impressive. It needs to be planted. The smallest seed, the most despised plant, the thing that rabbis argued about whether it should even be allowed in a garden that is what becomes a tree. The church that tries to look like a cedar may find itself cut down like the cedar of Assyria. The church that embraces its weediness may find itself sheltering the nations. The kingdom comes in the form of the insignificant, the invasive, the thing that the world cannot stop because the world refuses to take it seriously until it is too late. And that brings us to the final image of the parable, the one that sits at the edge of the text and refuses to be ignored. The mustard seed becomes a tree. The birds come and nest in its branches. And Jesus says nothing else. He does not explain what the birds mean. He does not tell us whether we are the tree or the birds or the man who sowed the seed. He leaves the image open, unfinished, demanding. And that is because the parable is not an answer. It is a question. What kind of kingdom are you expecting? What kind of kingdom are you hoping for? What kind of kingdom are you willing to be part of? Because the kingdom that Jesus describes is not the one you would design. It is not safe. It is not contained. It is not respectable. It is a weed that becomes a tree. It is corruption that becomes bread. It is the smallest thing that becomes everything. You are standing in the field. The seed is already in the soil. The yeast is already hidden in the dough. You cannot stop it. You cannot control it. You cannot make it grow faster or slower or in a different direction. The only thing you can do is decide whether you will call it a tree or a weed, whether you will call it bread or corruption, whether you will call it the kingdom or the end of the world as you knew it. And the parable does not tell you which name is correct. It only tells you that the kingdom is coming, and it will not ask your permission.